Okay, so we're diving into the source you sent about procrastination and
Well, let's be real. We've all been there, right?
yeah,
Deadlines are looming, and suddenly you just feel like reorganizing your sock drawer.
it's a universal struggle.
It really is.
And what I find so interesting about this source is that it really digs into the psychology behind why we procrastinate.
Yes.
It's not just about, telling yourself to just do it.
Right.
It's about understanding those deeper roots.
Totally. And like the source even talks about this procrastination monster. And honestly, sometimes it does feel like this like external force taking over.
It's a great metaphor because it's not always laziness, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes it is rooted in deeper psychological stuff like fear of failure.
Oh, yeah.
This source really unpacks how fear of failure can really hold us back.
Yeah, it's that voice in your head saying, what if it's not good enough?
Exactly, that nagging voice saying, what if I put in all this effort and it's still not good enough?
And it's interesting because the source connects this fear of failure to something called a fixed mindset.
What exactly is a fixed mindset?
Yeah, so a fixed mindset is basically this belief that our abilities are set in stone.
Okay.
So we're either, naturally good at something or we're not.
Okay.
And that belief can make us really afraid to try new things or to tackle challenges because we're so scared of confirming those limitations that we think we have.
So it's like we avoid things because we're afraid to prove to ourselves that we can't do it.
Exactly. And this source really emphasizes that a lot of fear of failure stems from that fixed mindset.
That makes sense.
Instead of seeing challenges as opportunities to grow,
Yeah.
we just avoid them altogether.
Totally. And I love that the source talks about cultivating a growth mindset.
Yes?
So it's shifting that inner voice from, I'm not good at this to, I'm not good at this yet.
Exactly. It's that tiny shift in language, but it makes a big difference.
It does.
And that shift in mindset can be really empowering when it comes to dealing with procrastination.
Okay, so we talked about fear of failure check.
The source also mentions another one of my favorites, perfectionism.
Yes, the desire for everything to be flawless, which ironically can prevent us from even starting.
It's so true.
This source makes a really good point about how often perfectionism is driven by fear of judgment from others.
Oh, yes, 100%. I get so caught up in wanting things to be perfect that I never actually finish anything.
It's a common trap, and this source suggests trying to reframe perfectionism a little bit.
Okay, how so?
So instead of striving for flawlessness, aim for excellence.
I like that.
Striving for your personal best while also acknowledging that nothing is ever going to be truly perfect.
That is a really helpful distinction.
Okay, so fear of failure, perfectionism. What about just plain old lack of motivation?
Sometimes I don't have the energy to even get started.
This source digs into that too, and it highlights how important it is to understand your why.
Okay.
Like if a task feels completely meaningless or disconnected from your values,
Really?
it's no wonder you're going to struggle to find motivation.
So before we even dive into solutions, it's important to figure out, why am I avoiding this? Is it fear, perfectionism, just not interested? It's like you have to diagnose the procrastination before you can treat it.
Exactly. And once you understand the why behind your procrastination, then you can start to implement some of those practical strategies to overcome it.
Which brings us to what this source calls the anti-procrastination arsenal.
Sounds kind of intense.
It does sound a bit intimidating, but it's really just about equipping ourselves with the right tools and techniques.
Okay, I like it.
And the first one they highlight is very classic, very crucial: planning and prioritizing.
Back to basics.
So to-do lists are making a comeback.
To-do lists are back in a big way, but it's not just about jotting down errands.
Yeah.
This source talks about having a system, whether it's an app or a planner, or even just good old-fashioned pen and paper,
Right.
but getting those to-dos out of your head and onto something visual where you can actually engage with them.
That makes sense because sometimes even just looking at my to-do list stresses me out so much that I just avoid it altogether.
And that's where prioritization comes in. And this source gets very specific about this.
Right.
It's not enough to just list everything out. You have to actually prioritize those tasks effectively.
So how do we prioritize effectively? Any tips from this source?
Yeah, this source is all about the Eisenhower matrix. Have you heard of that?
It sounds kind of familiar, but I'm not sure. Maybe.
Refresh my memory.
Yeah, so basically it's this really simple but powerful tool, and you categorize your tasks based on two things: urgency and importance.
Oh, okay.
So you've got things that are urgent and important. Those are your do-it-now tasks.
Right.
And then you've got things that are important but not urgent.
Yeah.
And those are your schedule-it tasks.
Okay, that's actually really helpful because I feel like the important but not urgent stuff always ends up on the back burner for me.
Totally.
Yeah.
And this source actually emphasizes how those are the tasks that can really move the needle, in terms of your long-term goals.
Okay.
So scheduling time for those is key.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, of course, you have those things that are urgent but not important.
Right.
And those are perfect for delegating if you can.
Love delegating.
Right.
Yes.
And then that leaves you with the things that are neither urgent nor important.
Okay.
And this source is pretty ruthless about those. They're like, just get rid of them.
Wow.
Or at least minimize the amount of time you spend on them.
Tough love from the procrastination gurus. I like it.
Okay, so we've got our prioritized to-do list.
Yeah.
We've got our game plan, but then there's the actual doing.
And sometimes just starting feels impossible.
This source had me nodding my head so hard when they talked about breaking down those like monster tasks.
Okay.
They call it chunking.
Chunking, yes, I've heard of that.
So it's basically about taking a large, potentially overwhelming task and breaking it down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
So instead of write a novel, it's write 500 words today.
Exactly. Or even brainstorm some character ideas.
Okay.
This source even suggests like visually breaking down your tasks. So if you have a big project,
Okay.
create a timeline, create a flowchart. Seeing those smaller steps laid out can make it feel a lot less daunting.
I love a good flow chart, so I'm into that.
Speaking of small steps, this source mentioned something called the 2-minute rule. What's that all about?
The 2-minute rule is all about building momentum. So if there's a task that you can complete in under 2 minutes, you do it immediately.
You know, it's funny because sometimes those tiny little tasks are the ones that take up the most mental space.
Totally.
They're just like cluttering up my brain.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that often once you start tackling those smaller tasks, it creates this momentum that then makes you want to take on bigger challenges.
I love that it's like tricking your brain into being productive.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've planned, we've prioritized, we've chunked it down, but what about distractions?
My phone is like a black hole for my attention span.
This source feels your pain.
Okay.
They have a whole section dedicated to creating a dedicated workspace. They call it your focus zone.
I like that.
And minimizing distractions is key. Whether that means, silencing your notifications, putting your phone in another room, or even investing in some noise-canceling headphones.
So basically, I need to recreate the library vibe wherever I am.
Pretty much.
Okay, I can do that.
This source also talks about being really mindful of the time of day
Okay.
when you're tackling certain tasks.
Okay.
Are you a morning person?
Not really.
Okay, well then you wouldn't want to schedule your most challenging tasks for first thing in the morning.
Exactly not my best work.
Right? So figure out when you're most alert and focused and try to schedule your most challenging tasks for then.
I can get behind that this is all starting to feel very strategic. I like it.
It is. And speaking of strategies, the source talks about the Pomodoro technique.
Have you ever tried that?
I've heard of it, but I always thought it was like some kind of cooking thing with tomatoes.
It does sound a little bit like that.
Right.
But no, the Pomodoro technique is all about focused work sprints. So you set a timer for 25 minutes.
Okay.
And you work on a single task without distractions, and then you take a short 5-minute break.
Okay.
And you repeat that cycle a few times, and then you take a longer break.
You know what? That actually sounds doable.
Right.
Because I think sometimes I get so overwhelmed by the idea of like sitting down to work for hours on end
Right.
that I just avoid it completely.
Exactly. And I think that's what this technique really addresses. It's like breaking down the work into manageable chunks.
Right.
And incorporating those regular breaks so it feels a lot less overwhelming.
It's like tricking my brain into productivity, one 25-minute chunk at a time. I like it. Okay, so we've talked about, the tactical side of things, but this source also talks about the importance of staying motivated.
Yes.
Which, let's be real, motivation isn't always a given.
It's not. It comes and goes. And this source is a big proponent of setting SMART goals.
Okay, SMART goals. That's another one of those things I've heard a lot about.
What does SMART stand for again?
So SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay.
And the source makes a really good point that each of these elements contributes to you staying motivated.
So break it down for me. Why are SMART goals so effective?
So when a goal is specific, you know exactly what you're working towards.
Okay.
Measurable means that you can track your progress, which can be really motivating.
Yes.
Achievable means that it's actually realistic.
Right.
So you're not setting yourself up for failure.
Because there's nothing worse than like having this goal that feels impossible to reach, and then you just feel defeated.
Exactly. And relevant means that it aligns with your values and your overall objectives.
Okay.
And then finally, time-bound. That gives you a deadline to work towards.
So it's like you have this roadmap instead of just saying, I want to do this vague thing at some point.
Right.
This is like actually giving yourself some concrete steps. I can see how that would be really helpful.
It can be really powerful. And this source also reminds us not to underestimate the power of celebrating wins, no matter how small.
Yes, celebrating the small wins. I love that.
It's so easy to get caught up in the what's next mentality.
Right.
But taking the time to acknowledge your accomplishments, even the small ones, can do wonders for your motivation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about planning, prioritizing, battling distractions, staying motivated.
But there's one last thing from this source that I really wanted to touch on.
Okay.
And that's this idea of taming perfectionism, because that is something I really struggle with.
It's a common one, and I think this source has a really great reminder, which is that done is better than perfect.
Ooh, I like that.
It's such a simple phrase, but it's so powerful.
It's so true.
Because perfectionism can really hold us back.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's just about shifting your mindset from aiming for flawlessness to aiming for progress.
I love that. And honestly, I feel like this entire conversation has really been about shifting mindsets.
It is.
From understanding the why behind our procrastination.
Right.
To kind of reframing how we approach these tasks and set these goals.
It's not about beating ourselves up for procrastinating.
Right.
It's about understanding those underlying reasons.
Okay.
Equipping ourselves with the right tools and just approaching the whole process with a bit more self-compassion.
Yes, 100%. So for our listener out there who's ready to tackle their to-do list and reclaim their time, what's the one thing we want them to take away from this conversation?
You know, procrastination is a common challenge, but it's a beatable one.
Okay.
So start small, experiment with these different techniques. Find what works for you, and remember to celebrate those victories along the way.
Progress over perfection. I love that. This has been so insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, we'll see you next time.